Welcome to Ancient Circles. I'm Bob Kelly. Normally, we think of history as a straight line, one event after the other, causes and effects, dates and names. But traditional cultures have always looked at history as a cycle, where old themes play out in ever new shapes. In this series of 4 radio essays, we'll follow these cycles as they play out on a small, green, and poor island in the Atlantic Ocean. It happens to be the ancestral home for 40 million Americans. In these programs, you'll hear from scholars and druids, prisoners and politicians. You'll meet an ancient warrior queen and a fighter in the contemporary Irish women's movement. You'll hear of wars for gold and God in Ireland and the Americas. And if you find it hard to believe that all these things are connected, stay tuned. You'll find out why this program is called Ancient Circles. Halloween always had a special place in my heart growing up, or was it my stomach? I remember going door to door in some ridiculous outfit, usually including a mask, yelling trick or treat, and filling up a brown paper bag with candy. But even with a last name like Kelly, I never dreamed that one day I would spend October 31st standing at a bonfire in Belfast, Ireland, thinking of Halloween's past. Tonight, however, wearing a mask was out of the question. The bonfire was less than a block from a British Army fort, and soldiers have been known to shoot people wearing masks in this neighborhood. Looking over at the fort, I couldn't help remembering the images from those old Saturday afternoon westerns. John Wayne peering out from behind the safety of his frontier fort at the fires of pagan savages. Only now I realized I was on the other side. I was one of the pagan savages around the fire. And the cameras recording our celebration from high atop this British fort weren't for making Saturday matinees. They were a piece of the Big Brother technology that has become part of life in West Belfast, a surveillance effort designed to identify and defeat the Irish Republican Army. The kids gathered around me, though Celtic in ancestry, were happily celebrating the Christianized version of Halloween, or All Saints' Eve. They were also laughing at the Americans standing in the rain with a tape recorder and microphone. Being a recovering altar boy and born-again pagan, I tried to explain that October 31st was actually New Year's Eve, or shaman, according to Celtic custom. But this serious bit of cultural education fell on deaf ears. These kids knew that while Halloween means free candy, New Year's Eve is when Mom and Dad go out and get drunk. Which holiday would you rather celebrate if you were a kid? As the biting cold rain continued its attack, I stepped closer to the bonfire. Looking into the dancing flames, my mind wandered back to the lives of my Celtic ancestors. I began to drift off.
On fire start, the rolling hillsides, figures dance around and around to drums that pulse, old echoes of darkness, moving to the pagan sound. Somewhere in a hidden memory, images float before my eyes. A fragrant night of stroll into bonfires, dancing chill and make some noise. I can see the lights in the distance, traveling in the dark world of night. Candles and lanterns are dancing, dancing walls around all souls night.
Toman O'Brien grew up in France after his father was forced to flee Ireland following the 1916 Easter Rebellion. But the family used to return to their native Kerry when he was young. He remembers sitting by the fire listening to the old fellas talk about how things used to be. This is what they said.
The Celtic year was divided according to the natural change of seasons. For our farming ancestors, the year began on November 1st, after the last apples were picked. All agricultural work ceased, and the earth rested, and fertility was renewed. During the festival, all household fires were extinguished and then relit from the ceremonial bonfire. Providing hospitality to one's dead ancestors was an important part of the feast, since the dead were thought to return to visit the homes where they lived. Barriers between our world and the other world are removed, and one can cross from one world into the other. The other major feasts in Celtic culture were Imbolc, February 1st, when Brigantia, goddess of all creative activity, rekindles the fire in the earth, preparing it for the re-emergence of green things. Beltane, May 1st, begins the bright summer half. In some areas, a hawthorn tree is cut down and used as a maypole. Cattle are driven between the sacred bonfires to protect them from disease. And finally, on August 1st, the Feast of Lughnasadh is held, signaling the beginning of the harvest. The greedy Fomorian earth spirit must be persuaded to relinquish the fruits of the soil for human use. It is the great sun god Lu who accomplishes this. The long festival season is marked by rituals to ensure a successful harvest. Great fairs are held with horse racing, sporting events, music, dancing, and the sale of crafts, all meant to reinforce the identity of the tribe.
Sounds like a powwow to me. My mind snapped back to Belfast in modern-day reality as the first rocket of the fireworks display exploded. The bang quickly turned my thoughts to a more serious matter. Where were the British Army foot patrols? During the 7th trip to Belfast in 10 years, I had witnessed an unusually massive British Army presence on the streets, but tonight they were nowhere to be seen. Then it hit me. The fireworks display had the British Army kind of nervous. Fearing the IRA would use the cover of these explosions to launch an attack, they decided to remain safely tucked away in their underground concrete bunkers. What the British Army didn't know, but would find out the next day, was that the IRA had organized and carried out a massive operation right under their noses. The IRA, like the Celtic warriors before them, have a tradition of punishing antisocial behavior in the communities. Under the Celtic Brehon laws, the worst punishment for a tribal member was banishment from his tua, or tribal territory, for unacceptable social behavior. Selling drugs, other than alcohol, of course, is about as unacceptable as you can get in Ireland. After years of repeated warnings and police indifference, the IRA moved swiftly on the Celtic New Year.
They marched in dealers' houses and ordered them to quit. Time and time again they warned we've had enough of it. Dirty needles in our doorways, junkies hanging all about. Keep on dealing heroin and you're gonna be moved out.
One major drug dealer was assassinated. 8 others were given punishment shootings, and 90 houses were raided. The IRA issued a statement taking responsibility for these actions.
The IRA, while content with the progress in this operation, is nevertheless not complacent. We realize that the drug problem facing our community is not solely one of criminal elements profiting on the misery and addiction of others. We have no illusions about the difficulties facing our community in dealing with the problem associated with drugs, but we maintain determined to pursue our operations against the pushers and suppliers in this trade of misery.
The day after the operation, I ran into Michael Ferguson at a rally called by Sinn Féin, the political party of the Republican movement. Michael is an elected Sinn Féin councillor from the Lisburn district of Belfast and has 2 young sons. He speculates on the reasoning behind these raids.
There is no drug problem in our schools. However, over the last couple of years, there have been serious attempts to organise a structure for the distribution of drugs in our community. The community itself identified this as a threat to its very fabric. They saw what had happened elsewhere, and they've seen what's happened in America to communities, where whole communities have been devastated by drugs. So the IRA took action because the community doesn't want its children to be fed drugs in school. Women in this area want to be able to freely walk the streets. So in actual fact, the community defended itself. The IRA defended its community, of which they are a part of.
The struggle to keep drugs off the streets of Belfast is relatively new. The reason they're there is complex and historic. Anyone who has studied indigenous cultures and their spiritual beliefs understands that expanded states of consciousness were a natural part of certain ceremonies and rituals.
In the cool of the evening, they used to gather, neath the stars in the meadow, circle near an old oak tree. At the times appointed by the seasons of the years and the phases of the moon, in the center often stood a woman, equal with the others, respected for her word. One of the many we call the witches, the healers, the teachers of the wisdom of the earth. And the people grew in the knowledge she gave them, herbs to heal their bodies, smells to make their spirits whole.
When these practices were outlawed by the Christian Church, it created a void in the spiritual lives of many people. Those who continued to practice pagan ceremonies were persecuted and hunted down. Many people are familiar with Europe's 14th century witch hunts, a campaign by the church targeting women who possessed knowledge of healing and sacred herbs and who were seen as a threat to the ruler's control of the people.
They were those who came to power through domination. They were bonded in their worship of a dead man on a cross. They sought control of the common people by demanding allegiance to the Church of Rome. And the Pope, he commenced the Inquisition, was a war against the women whose powers they feared. In this Holocaust, in this age of evil, 9 million European women, they died. And the tale is told of those who by the hundreds, holding hands together, chose their deaths in the sea, while chanting the praises of the mother goddess, a refusal of betrayal, women were dying to be free.
But persecution wasn't the only tool the colonizers used to control indigenous peoples. In North America, alcohol was used to attack and neutralize the native population. In Ireland, it has been used the same way for centuries. Remember that today, the two groups of people who are routinely stereotyped as chronic drunks are Native Americans and the Irish. This kind of propaganda tactic ensures that the savage natives appear culturally inferior to the conqueror. Therefore, it's okay to steal their land and resources. Jerry Adams is president of Sinn Féin, the party that campaigns for Irish unification. He says that suppressing the native culture has historically been a part of Britain's colonial policy, so much that it even affects the island's native language.
A strong, resilient, culturally sound section of Irish people is not what the British want. They want us involved in Coca-Cola culture and bubblegum culture and all that goes with it. Irish still has no legal status in this state. I can be arrested, or you can be arrested for giving the Irish version of your name.
The intense political, cultural, and economic divisions in this part of Ireland are testament to the long-term effectiveness of the colonial strategy of divide and conquer. As in America, such differences are exploited to create an atmosphere of hate and intolerance. But England was certainly not the first country to discover the value of propaganda. Roman legions attacked and occupied Celtic Britain 1,100 years before the British in turn invaded Ireland. So to understand what is happening in Ireland today, It helps to return to the conflict's ancient roots. Like most other indigenous people, the Celts lived in harmony with Mother Earth. Life and death were seen as part of the same circle. All living things had a spirit that was part of a web of life. Tribal members did not see themselves as dominating nature, but as one strand in the web. The dogma of Christian religion came into direct conflict with this Celtic belief system when missionaries arrived on the island. In his 1983 book, The Way of Wyrd, British author Brian Bates recreates the first encounters between Christian monks and the spiritual teachers of Celtic society. The Druid explains,
"We are simple people with simple beliefs. We honor the sun, the moon, and the stars on account of their shining brightness. We believe in fire because of its sudden heat, also water and the earth because they nourish all things. To understand our ways, you must learn the true meaning of wyrd, not the version your masters have concocted to fit their beliefs. Remember that I told you our world began with fire and frost? By themselves, neither fire nor frost can accomplish anything, but together they create the world. And they must maintain a balance, for too much fire would melt the frost, and excessive frost would extinguish the fire."
Standing by the fire on this cold Belfast Halloween, these words rang more significant than they had before. And I remembered that in the Celtic world, the 4 major feasts all included the use of fire, one of the Celts' 4 sacred elements, along with wind, water, and the earth. The island's first inhabitants had arrived some 11,000 years ago, just after the Ice Age. No wonder fire and frost were so important to them. But the Druid had more to say to the monk.
"But just as the world of gods, Middle-earth and the dead are constantly replenished by the marrying of fire and frost, so also they depend upon the balance and eternal cycle of day and night, winter and summer, woman and man, weak and strong, moon and sun, death and life. These forces and countless others form the end points of a gigantic web of fibers which cover all worlds. The web is the creation of the forces and its threads, shimmering with power, it passes through everything."
This Celtic concept of the web of life has parallels in Native American philosophy as well. Listen to the words of Chief Seattle, read by American Indian Movement leader Vernon Belcourt.
"Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the people of the earth. We humans did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it. What we do to the web, we do to ourselves. Tribe follows tribe, nation follows nation. Like the waves of the sea, it is the order of nature, and regret is useless. Your time of decay may be distant, but it will surely come. For even the white man whose God walked and talked among them as friend to friend could not be exempt from the common destiny. We may be family after all. We will see."
The spiritual belief system of the Celtic people first came under attack when the Roman Empire started to expand northward in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. By 60 AD, the Roman armies had successfully invaded France, Switzerland, and Celtic Britain. Their final destination was the Celts' sacred island, Ireland. Their motive was one that would become familiar in world history: the lust for gold. Seamus McManus, in his book The Story of the Irish Race, writes,
"Ireland was rich in gold. It was the one country above all others in Western Europe that was distinguished for its gold wealth. The ancient gold of Scandinavia came chiefly from Ireland. The gold ornaments preserved in the National Museum in Dublin weigh 570 ounces, while in the British Museum the total gold ornament collection from England, Wales, and Scotland combined is only 50 ounces.
The Roman Emperor Nero had heard of Ireland's Wicklow Mountain gold, traded throughout Europe along an ancient Celtic route. What he hadn't heard was that while the Roman Empire used gold as money, its use by the Celts was religious in nature. Their beautiful golden objects were crafted under the watchful eyes of the Druid high priests. In addition to being displayed as a sign of personal status, these objects were thrown into sacred wells and buried in tombs as offerings to their gods. This fundamental difference in attitude has persisted for 2,000 years, as conquering armies ravished the lands of indigenous people who were unlucky enough to have gold. The native people of the Americas, Australia, and Africa are only the latest victims of this mentality.
Well, you see, the Black Hills was a very special place.
Bill Means is Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council.
The Black Hills was the center of our nation. We are the people of the Black Hills, the Lakota people. And this is where our creation story takes place. So to us, the Black Hills means as much to our people as the Vatican means to the Roman Catholic Church, or what Jerusalem means to Christians and Muslims and Jews, because we live primarily on the plains. But the Black Hills was a place where our people were buried, where we went to fasts, where we went for very special reasons. So it was a very special place, and the discovery of gold there really almost brought about the total desecration of this very sacred place. The Black Hills was part of a treaty agreement in which the United States negotiated with our people, the Lakota Nation, final treaty being in 1868. And after that treaty was signed, gold was discovered. And once gold was discovered, and then of course the army came in order to protect the settlers who were moving in with the miners into the Black Hills. So of course our Indian people, in defending their lands, were then banded as criminals. And then our nation, which was set aside in the 1868 treaty, was subsequently divided up into 6 reservations. And so then the policy of apartheid was begun as a result of the quest for gold.
Throughout the history of gold-driven conquest, destroying indigenous spiritual structures was a top priority. The Romans struggled hard to conquer Celtic Britain, and they knew that ultimate success would depend on breaking their enemies' cultural cohesiveness. With this in mind, they invaded the island of Mona off Britain's northwestern coast. This was where hundreds of Druid priests from throughout Europe had taken refuge. Researchers Ann Ross and Don Robbins describe the scene in their book, The Life and Death of a Druid Prince.
The Romans faced an armed mass of Celts intermingled with Druids, both men and women, shrieking curses upon them. The sight was so weird and unnerving that at first the legionnaires stood watching in terror, unable to move. This was the Druids' first important and concerted appearance upon the stage of world history. It was also to be their last.
They came in their long ships from lands beyond the sea. They came in their long ships, they saw the land was green. Wind in the barley, trout and salmon leaping in the rivers, sun in the yellow corn. Leaping ashore, they slaughtered those who labored in the barley, scything them down like corn.
That day in 60 AD marks a watershed in Celtic history, for it was precisely here that the oral spiritual traditions of the Celtic nations came into contact with an invading army using a written history. The Romans, I'm sure you remember, were the first really well-armed and organized thieves who wrote their own press releases. Howard Zinn, author of A People's History of the United States, thinks we need to be careful when reading the stories of conquest in our history books.
We must not accept the memory of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country conceals fierce conflicts of interest between the conquerors and the conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. And in such a world of conflict, a world of victims and executioners, it is the duty of thinking people not to be on the side of the executioners.
The Roman invaders did not completely achieve their goals. Following the assault on Mona, a Celtic Druid queen named Boudica mounted a counterattack back on the British mainland. She led 80,000 warriors into battle against the 9th Roman Legion, each time letting loose a hare on the battlefield as a symbol of female power. Boudica's army destroyed the legion and then leveled the Roman-controlled cities of London, Gloucester, and St. Albans. The success of this counterattack persuaded the Roman Empire to call off its planned invasion of Ireland.
The island lies like a leaf upon the sea, Green island like a leaf new fallen from the tree. Green turns to gold as morning breezes gently shake the barley, bending the yellow corn. No force on earth can ever trap the wind that shakes the barley, or the sun in the yellow corn.
It was several centuries until the next attempt to invade Ireland. But this time, it wasn't a colonial army. It was the missionaries of the new Church of Rome. This was where the doctrine of manifest destiny was born, with the Christian manifesto claiming that the theft of land and resources was predestined by the will of God. We don't have very precise records of the Christian invasion of Ireland, at least not from the native perspective. But in this country, the takeover of native spirituality by the church is fairly recent, and there are many people alive who remember how it worked. Bill Means is one of them. He is a member of the Lakota Nation, one of the last to fight the colonial armies.
We've come to know a term in international law that's becoming more accepted called ethnocide. This is a role that the churches play. They do to the mind what you can't do with the bullet. That is converting people from traditional ways of relation to the Creator, traditional ways of worship. They destroyed a lot of that, created some of the first boarding schools, as some of us experienced, and of course took on the whole system of acculturation and assimilation.
Brothers sharpening their leathers, learn it by heart, that's the rule. All I remember is dreading September in school, and they gave me the better their words. The fool that I am, or the wise that I be, and they gave me the lessons or notes. It wasn't their fault, I was me, not the one that you see.
When these boarding schools were created initially, you weren't allowed to speak your language, for example. Your hair was cut immediately. All traditional clothing was replaced by military clothing, and you were not allowed to speak your language. So it was almost as if they were creating a social experiment on every reservation. As we say in our communities, the Christians came with the Bible, and we had the land. Now we got the Bible, and they got the land.
Floyd Westerman, Native American songwriter and actor, now famous for his role as Chief Ten Bears in Dances with Wolves, wrote a song about these Christian missionaries.
Spread the word of your religion, convert the whole world if you can. Kill and slaughter those who oppose you. It's worth it if you save one man. Take the land to build your churches, a sin to tax the house of God. Take a child while he is apples, spoil the mind and spare the rod. Go and tell the savage native that he must be Christianized. Tell him end his heathen worship, and you'll make him civilized. Serve the gospel, force your values down his throat until it's raw, And after he is crippled, turn your back and lock the door.
In 432 AD, a reconnaissance team was sent to Ireland by the Church of Rome. Its leader was one Father Patrick, not yet a saint, though he had just been appointed to the position of archbishop in this all-male club of Latin speakers.
Domine sancte pater omnipotens aeterne Deum, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Following the establishment of monasteries on the island, Catholic monks were sent out to observe the rituals and ceremonies of Celtic worship. The strategy was simple: infiltrate the spiritual world of the Celts and substitute Christian ceremonies for their pagan rituals. British scholar Brian Bates recreates one story from the era when Christian monks worked in the pagan territories of Celtic Britain. The story is told from the perspective of a young monk sent to the pagan forest to meet a druid and gather intelligence about native religion. Early in their acquaintance, the monk tells the druid that, quote, "When men come to God, there will be no more killing." The druid responds,
"The warrior kings will use your God as an addition to their sword power. He will become another justification for their military exploits. Warriors are people who choose to live by the sword. They wager their lives against the odds of losing it in exchange for the golden gifts of a warlord."
When I first read this quote, it sounded familiar. And sure enough, I had read something a lot like it before, in a statement by Oliver Cromwell to the British Parliament in 1649. Cromwell had landed in Ireland with 30,000 soldiers to put down resistance to the British occupation of Irish soil. During his reign of terror, he slaughtered 3,000 men, women, and children in the town of Drogheda. In his report to the British House of Commons, he said,
"It has pleased God to bless our endeavour at Drogheda. The enemy were about 3,000 strong in the town. I believe we put to the sword the whole number. This has been a marvellous great mercy. I wish that all honest hearts may give the glory of this to God alone, to whom indeed the praise of this mercy belongs."
Once again, the Celtic spiritual structures were being attacked. This had been the Roman strategy almost 1,600 years earlier with the attack on the Druids at Mona. Following Cromwell's invasion, the lush Irish farms became the golden gifts of the warlord. Native Irish farmers were systematically displaced by Scottish and English settlers, many of them soldiers. As in other religious crusades, an empire was expanding in the name of God. Granted, this seems to be a long way from Halloween. Well, people always tell me I can't stick to the point. Back to the bonfire. Having had no luck educating the candy-craving kids, my friend Jared Kelly and I walked up to the Sloan's Club for a few pints. Watching a crowd of wild Celts dance seemed like a good way to celebrate the New Year. After the fireworks stopped, a British Army foot patrol ventured out of their fort. They came into the club, automatic rifles at the ready, to wish us all a Happy New Year. The DJ happened to put this song on as the soldiers stood glaring at the crowd.
Turn up the double, flash for my day and night overtime. 714, flies the line. Maniac, radiac, winning the game. I'm the lyrical Jesse James. Quality, I possess, don't stay on fresh. When my voice won't screw the rest of the microphone that I can hold it. Copywritten lyrics only can't be shown if they are not. Don't be the police, you're trying to say them, your voice is sick. So speak, stay on my back, or I will attack, and you don't want that.
The next morning, clearing the cobwebs from my throbbing head, I reflected on the previous night's activities. I couldn't help but think that somehow it was appropriate to bring in the Celtic New Year with a clear rejection of the drug culture currently sweeping the planet. Yeah, right. This has been part 1 of Ancient Circles, a series of 4 radio essays about the past, present, and future of Ireland. In part 2, you'll hear what the Vietnam War and the war in Ulster have in common. And you'll hear from 2 former members of the Irish Republican Army talking about life and death on the front lines. It's not what you'd imagine. Ancient Circles was made possible in part by a KFAI Film in the City Studio Access Grant, with funds made available by the National Endowment for the Arts. Our engineer was Chris O'Dowd. Monica Boyerline was the co-producer. The music was by Christy Moore, the Chieftains, Kevin Locke, the Lakota Ray Soldiers Drum, Anya, Floyd Red Crow Westerman, and Snap. Special thanks to Larry Burke, Kevin Flynn, Dan Gleason, Ewan Kerr, David Lowe, Bill Means, and Toman O'Brien. I'm Bob Kelly. Slán go Foil.
Mm-hmm.